Welcome to all. I'm going to say a few words in French to start the new academic year, and then we will get what you hope for. J'aimerais adresser un mot de très chaleureux bienvenue à tous nos nouveaux étudiants. Ils sont un peu plus de 360 à nous rejoindre cet automne. Nous avons dit au revoir à 250 étudiants vendredi passé qui nous quittent après avoir obtenu leur diplôme. Et à ces nouveaux étudiants qui viennent de près de 70 pays à travers le monde, j'aimerais souhaiter des années d'études fructueuses, enrichissantes, en même temps qu'une expérience au contact de personnes du monde entier et d'une cité qui a beaucoup de richesses, d'une expérience qui les marquera pour la vie. J'aimerais également dire au revoir à plusieurs collègues, plusieurs professeurs qui nous quittent cette année, qui prennent leur retraite. Jean-Pierre Jacob, Isabelle Milbert, Jean-Michel Servet, et ainsi qu'à Gareth Austin, qui nous quitte pour l'université de Cambridge. Ça, c'est une moins bonne nouvelle, mais il faut bien que la richesse circule à travers le monde. J'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à 9 nouveaux collègues dont je vais vous lire rapidement les noms. Caroline Biltoft, professeure assistante en histoire internationale, doctorat de Princeton. Kemal Dervis, professeur ordinaire en économie internationale, doctorat de Princeton. Julia Kajal-Kurossi, professeur assistant en économie internationale, doctorat de Warwick. Susanna Hecht, professeur ordinaire en histoire internationale, doctorat de Berkeley. Graciela Moraes Silva, professeur assistant en sociologie, en anthropologie et sociologie, doctorat de Harvard. Vin Kim Nguyen, professeur ordinaire, doctorat en médecine de l'Université de Montréal et d'anthropologie médicale de l'Université McGill. Seungmin Rho, professeur assistant en sciences politiques de Stanford. Patricia Speyer, professeur ordinaire en anthropologie et sociologie, doctorat de Chicago. Et Fouad Zarbiev, professeur assistant en droit international, doctorat de notre institut. 9 professeurs, 6 femmes, nous sommes très contents de vous accueillir parmi nous cette année. J'aimerais profiter de cette occasion, de cette cérémonie d'ouverture de l'année académique qui s'accompagne, comme chaque 2 ans, de l'attribution du prix Edgar de Picciotto pour adresser une pensée émue à ce grand homme, à cet homme exceptionnel qui nous a quittés au début de cette année. Je salue les membres de sa famille qui sont là ce soir en leur disant que nous avons été tous très touchés par la disparition de cette personnalité extraordinaire qui nous manque puisque par sa hauteur de vue, l'acuité de son esprit, il nous a gratifié, il m'a gratifié en particulier de moments inoubliables. J'aimerais à présent appeler au podium M. Rolf Soiron, président du conseil de fondation de l'Institut, ainsi que M. Paul Krugman pour la remise du prix Edgar de Picciotto.
Dear Professor Krugman, it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you here for this year's award ceremony as the recipient 2016 of the Edgar de Picciotto International Prize. This prize has been created in order to pay respect and to honor the memory of the late Edgar de Picciotto. Philippe Burin also mentioned him. His generosity has made it possible to build this wonderful student house on the other side of the rails, which today hosts so many students from all over the world. And as Philippe said, Edgar de Picciotto is or has been a living witness to the fact that those who are privileged more than the others have to pay something back to society. And this is what he did. And I would also like to particularly welcome the members of his family here in order to show them that Edgar de Picciotto has not been forgotten and will not be forgotten here. The prize which you are going to receive today honors academics which have won the respect of the world, academics who have significantly contributed to understanding global challenges, but also academics whose work has impacted international decision-making. Perhaps not as much as they want, but it has impacted decision-making. You are the third recipient of this award. Your predecessors were in 2012 Amartya Sen, who everybody knows in this room, and in 2014 Saul Friedlander, who unfortunately has also passed away. This shows you that this prize is younger than the Nobel Prize, which you already won in 2008, but the trajectory which we created with this series, Amartya Sen, Saul Friedlander, Paul Krugman now, is very promising, and perhaps at a certain moment the two trajectories are going to cross. Dear Professor Krugman, the audience knows who you are, and introducing too much details would be carrying owls to Athens, coal to Newcastle, or wisdom to the many academic places in which you have been, starting in Yale, then going to the MIT, for a short period of time to Stanford, to Princeton, to the London School of Economics, and now to the City University of New York. You have well used your time, and you have used it in a way that in 2008, as I said, the Nobel Committee could not help itself. It had to award you the prize of 2008, because your contributions to what you call the new economic geography have been seminal, as well as your research to income distribution and other things. I do not know how you do it, but you have been extremely prolific in communicating your research all the time. We have not, and we admit it all, read your over 20 books, though some of them would have been readable for many of us, but intentionally, and this is typical as well, you wrote these books for a general audience, and not only for the eggheads, which usually read complicated economic models. You have written over 200 articles, which appeared then in peer-reviewed journals or seminar publications, but probably more typical of you are the more than 750 articles which you published in the New York Times and in other general publications on general issues like income distribution, taxation, macroeconomics, and international economics. We all know that these contributions have not only made friends of you, because in many of these cases you were absolutely clear, and you never supported those who, like zealots, just believe in models or who follow their ideologies all the time. You always pleaded for something like a rational approach and also for issues like equity and other topics which need to be emphasized if we really care for global issues. I said this award is given to academics which have won international respect, which have contributed to understanding issues, and which have had an influence. These are the reasons, Paul Krugman, for which I have the honor to hand you over the International Edgar de Picciotto Prize 2016. Please join me in applauding you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for what such introductions are always painful, and thank you, and even though it was painful, and thanks to the Picciotto family, of course, for this magnificent institution of the gift now, and for allowing me to share in it. Thanks to the Graduate Institute for hosting me, and I actually thought to myself for a moment this morning that I'm almost a little embarrassed now thinking about what I'm going to speak about, because here I am in Geneva. I went jogging in the park this morning past the WTO. I should be talking about globalization and trade and international institutions, but I'm not. I'm still going to be talking about an issue which is, I didn't think I'd be speaking about at this point in my life. Obviously, like everyone who was had any sense, I got very involved in trying to understand the great financial crisis of 2008 and what it meant. But if you had asked even me, I think, in 2008 or so, what will you be talking about in 2016? I didn't think I'd still be talking about that. But it turns out that, first of all, in the real world, we are nowhere close to having overcome all of we're still in an era defined by the aftermath of that crisis. And second, I feel that we have not really, at multiple levels, taken on board, taken the lessons from that crisis and what it should mean. So I'm going to try and talk about, I say, what have we learned? In some ways, it's what we should have learned from the crisis, where we ought to be now, things that might, lessons that would be helpful if we in fact did accept them, and also a little bit about why we haven't, or if you like, the lessons. One of the lessons is how reluctant so many people of importance, both in academics and in real world, are not willing to learn from crises. So I'll talk about that as well. Just a word, since that gracious, embarrassing introduction mentioned about having an influence. So let me tell you about all the times in which I've spoken to people with actual power and they've taken my advice. Let's see. I can think of one, which was unfortunately not in my own country. But anyway, all right. Okay. So if I can, I don't know what will happen if I do this. Will something... no, that's several ahead of where I want to be. Let's see if we can make it start at the beginning. Oh, well, maybe not. All right. Yes, the question, all right, is, so let me just start before I get to my 3 points. the financial crisis, actually conventional, what people who do histories of it usually date the start of it to the summer of 2007, even though the real economy didn't go terribly wrong until sometime after that. In July 2007, a couple of BNP Paribas had to close a couple of funds. That was really the point when you started to see that there were financial institutions were not holding up under the strain. And so if you like, you can start the crisis in July 2007. If you want to wait until there's a global recession, you'd be going into early 2008 before it starts. But however you count it, this is a long time. We are now more than 9 years past the point where the financial system started to creak, started to come apart under the strain. We're more than 8 years after the beginning of a global recession, and we're still very much in it. The United States, the unemployment rate is about back to where it was before, but it's been a long time coming. In Europe, the unemployment rate has only made up about half of the ground that was lost in the crisis, and the aftershocks are still out there. In many ways, the financial world, the world of policy, is nothing like it was. So this era has gone on, which is, as I said, a very long time. And I have an ongoing puzzle and gripe, if you like, which is why, given that it's gone on so long, has so little, either in the way we talk about economics or in the way we do economic policy, why has so little changed? And you might say, well, isn't it always that way? And the answer is no, not to the same extent. I grew up intellectually. I was a graduate student in the 1970s. And I remember the effect that stagflation had on everything. The combination of unemployment and high inflation was taken as an incredible shock, as a tremendous lesson, showing us that many of the ideas that some economists had espoused were wrong, that others were right. Everything from the way that textbooks were written to the advice that economists gave to central bankers and politicians changed. The theory changed. The reputations of particular economists either rose sharply, as in the case of Milton Friedman, or declined somewhat, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So stagflation was a tremendously revolutionary period. It was a period where everyone said, well, we must learn the lessons of this. This crisis we're still living in has gone on, by most measures, longer than the stagflation of the 1970s. It is worse in terms of the impact on incomes, the impact on GDP, on employment, and I think the human costs have been much higher than that of stagflation. And yet not a whole lot has changed. When all is said and done, most of the people who had particular economic views within the profession and in the world at large in 2007, 2008, are still saying the same things now that they were. If you look at the world's central banks, they all had a 2% inflation target, which they would argue at some length was the right thing to do given what we knew about the world. Well, the world looks very different from the way we thought it did. Still 2% inflation targets, which they're by and large not hitting. Politicians who railed against the evils of budget deficits and debt are still railing against the evils of budget deficits and debt. There's been an amazing amount of stasis in the whole scene of both economic thinking and economic policy. And the question would be, shouldn't it have changed? If it did, what should have changed, and why hasn't there been more change? And that's kind of my theme here. Now, I could just give you a long checklist. In fact, when I started trying to put together my notes, that's the way it was. I was just throwing out all of these various things that bother me, things that people are not getting. And I realized at a certain point that would just come out as a long whine. Maybe that's the way this is coming out anyway. But anyway, that was not the way to do it. That I wanted to group this into three big categories, which are the ones we have here. One is that it's not all, oh my God, stuff has happened, we don't understand it. In fact, in some ways, it's the opposite. In some ways, one of the great shocks of this whole era has been how comprehensible a lot of things have turned out to be, but only if you came at them with the right set of ideas, and ones that were actually rather unfashionable ideas. The second, I think we have learned quite a lot about financial markets, but not in quite the way that many people put it, and I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, we've learned a little bit, actually rather a lot, about our colleagues and our political masters, most of it not very good. So I'll get to all of that at the end. All right, so old ideas. I have said this, I think, on a number of occasions, but I think I can drive it home a little bit more clearly in this lecture. I often think that if we ask, how did economists, how did the academic profession deal with this crisis? If we had taken the state of economic understanding of the way we did macroeconomics about the time that I was about to go off to graduate school, early 1970s, would have actually turned out to be rather useful. Given the state of economic understanding and doctrine as it was as of the time that the crisis actually hit, I think it turns out that we were less useful as a profession than we would have been, that we actually were less prepared for this crisis than our fathers and grandfathers of the profession, our academic fathers and grandfathers. Actually, there's a family side point there. There's a now, if you're in the international trade business, there's the family tree of international trade people, which has and so Richard Baldwin here is my son, and by that tree, and then there's there all of his students are grandchildren. Anyway, but so what I realized is that. But I started to put a face on my image of this hypothetical person who had not been contaminated by modern macroeconomics and would have gotten things mostly right. And I started realizing I'm calling that person imaginary James Tobin, based upon the real James Tobin, who I think I can model what he would have said. Let's say this, to a fair extent, what I had to say about economics in the post-2008 period was channeling those ideas. I'm of sort of almost the last cohort of economists who learned the old stuff. And I mean, I hope that we try to get the students to wait for a minute before the more heavily mathematicized things and talk about the simple models. I'm not sure how often that gets through. But if you came at Anyway, I came in with something that was grounded in John Hicks from the 1930s and Tobin from the 50s and 60s, and said those are usually my first pass at understanding things. And I had an experience of my own sense of understanding, which is very, very different from the way most people, I think about economists in the crisis. The general view is, well, economists failed. And the crisis proved that they know nothing, and so it's been an utter disaster. The Queen of England sent a letter. Why didn't you see this? But my experience has actually been that for the first time I felt reasonably sure that I was not a phony. So if you do economics, which is not full of lots of hard experiments, and how are you really? Do you really understand things? Are you actually doing something? I wasn't trying to be a phony, but maybe I was just a glib talker and a slick mathematical modeler. And did I actually know anything? We came into not so much the crisis itself, which I didn't see coming. I had a phrase actually for an entirely different crisis many years ago, which people would say, you got it right, and I say, no, I got it. I got it 90% wrong. It's just that most of the other people got it 150% wrong. So it was just kind of that in this case, I saw a housing bubble. I thought it would be nasty when it burst, but I had no idea it could be this nasty. But it wasn't actually all that much of a. Once I realized what institutional things I'd been missing, that almost all of us have been missing, the crisis itself made sense. And what came afterwards, there were three big issues where people who were raised on imaginary James Tobin type models had very, very different predictions about what was going to happen than people who did not. I'll give you 3 predictions. First, we had this enormous expansion, enormous monetary expansion, as the Federal Reserve in particular, the Bank of England to an even greater degree in some ways, the ECB less so at that point. But as the major central banks tried to fight the crisis, they printed lots of money. They don't actually print mostly these days. It's all ones and zeros. But they created huge amounts of monetary base, of things that can be turned into bank reserves or currency. Very widespread view that this would mean lots of inflation. Printing money causes inflation. And there were blood-curdling warnings of high inflation, even hyperinflation, from many practical people and some economists. We'll get a bit of that later on. But people like me said, well, no, we're close to the zero lower bound. Interest rates can't go below zero. It actually turns out they can a little bit, that's actually been an interesting revelation, but I think not a very important one. And under those conditions, it's just not going to do that. The money's just going to sit there. And we were right. Second was budget deficits. We had, for a while, there very large budget deficits. Isn't that going to drive up interest rates? The governments are all out there borrowing. And again, if you came at it from, many people believed that, insisted on that. If you came at it from the perspective, however, of these very basic sort of economic models, old-fashioned macroeconomic models, you said, no, not under these conditions. Because a situation where the economy is still depressed, even at near zero interest rates, is in effect a situation where there are more savings that people want to do than there's willing investors. And so there's this pool of savings with no place to go, and borrowing from it shouldn't drive up interest rates. And sure enough, interest rates have actually been at historic lows all the way along. And then there was the question of what would happen if you had big changes in fiscal policy, where the big ones that were not simply the result of the initial recession mostly came out of austerity policies. And what would those do? And again, there was a widespread view that austerity policies, by showing that governments were responsible, would raise confidence and be expansionary. Either that or just, no, fiscal policy, that's an old-fashioned notion that it matters and it's not going to hurt. Jean-Claude Trichet said the view that austerity will depress economies is incorrect. But those of us with the old-fashioned model said, no, actually it's correct, and yeah, it was. So those are 3 pretty big wins, and they left me feeling a whole lot better about my, was the stuff that I was doing actually real? It looks like it kind of was. It was a success. So let me talk just a moment about those things. So, actually, I'm sorry. I want to talk about Tobin for a moment. I completely lost my train of thought. Let me talk about the real James Tobin for a second, and then I'll show you that picture. Okay, I was a grad student in the 70s. There was I remember actually, I knew Tobin a little bit. I was his student as a freshman, and then for a couple of years I was his colleague at Yale. And he talked about having met someone, on the street, who recognized his name, and he said, the enemy of Milton Friedman. Which was, and it was true, it was viewed that there was a battle between Tobin and Friedman, which everyone said Friedman won. And the reason was stagflation. Friedman had famously argued, along with Edward Phelps at Columbia, that there was no trade-off between unemployment and inflation, at least in the long run. That if you had low unemployment, inflation would rise, that would get built into people's expectations, the inflation would accelerate ever further. And Tobin was skeptical. He was willing to argue, yes, you can't have very low unemployment without having inflation go extremely high, but he argued that at low inflation, there might well still be a trade-off. And his 1972 presidential address to the American Economic Association made that argument, saying, we've gone too far with this stuff. And he actually, one of his arguments, he said, if this natural rate thing were true, we should have seen accelerating deflation in the 1930s, which we did not. that it actually seems to be really hard. And his argument was that, in particular, people really are reluctant to cut nominal wages. It's just very hard to get anybody to cut a wage. Not just that workers object, but employers object. It's a very big thing, and so that there's a kind of a rigidity there, and that doesn't, now even if overall wages are rising, there will always be some people whose equilibrium wage is falling, and the lower the inflation rate, the more people are going to be in that position. So he argued that there would still be a long run trade-off, and by God, so we've had very high unemployment in a lot of the advanced world in recent years. For the most part, very few countries have seen major declines in wages. The one exception is Greece, and that, it's funny, if you go back and read the Tobin lecture, he said, look, if it's bad enough for long enough, then wages will eventually go down, as they did around 1933 in the United States. But otherwise not. And you can look at the distribution of wage changes. And so this is courtesy of Olivier Blanchard, who gave me this chart. This is the distribution of wage changes in Portugal, which is not Greece, but second only to Greece in terms of nastiness of what has happened. 1984 is what it looks like normally, where there is that spike at zero. So even in reasonably okay times, there's going to be some people whose wages really, in some sense, should be falling, but don't, because no one likes to cut wages. Look at them in 2012. It's basically everybody has wages that are frozen at zero. Tobin turns out to have been right. Tobin's vision and his everyone took the stagflation of the 70s to prove that he was wrong, and there was a kind of a sense that it was a little bit sad to see Tobin standing against these validated ideas, but it turns out he was right. So the old ideas have turned out to have a lot more life in them than I think anyone realized at the time. That's on the supply side, if you like. That's about why weak spending doesn't translate into deflation. And why, of course, therefore, you can have a long period of depressed economies without the notion that the economy always quickly returns to a normal level of employment turns out to be wrong when it's on the downside. What about the determinants of spending? So we have now. I have just a quick picture of this is for the U.S. and now one thing where we have made progress is data availability. I suppose I'll have to get this a prettier version, but my God, that's the Federal Reserve Economic Data site. FRED is which is actually run from St. Louis, is spectacularly great for quickly putting together things. So that blue line is the monetary base. That's printing money, not literally, but in effect. And in the U.S., we had a almost five-fold increase in the monetary base over a quite short period of time, which many people thought would be wildly inflationary. The green line at the bottom is actual, not even prices, it's GDP in money terms. And guess what? Although the increase in the monetary base didn't translate basically at all into an increase in GDP. Who could have imagined such a thing? Well, actually anybody who knew their old-fashioned ISLM type economic analysis. That's exactly what the models predicted would happen, and sure enough, it did. And interestingly, so I've seen a fair number of people, including economists who really should know better, saying, well, there's something really weird because, look, we increased the monetary base, but it didn't translate into increases in the broader money supply. Measures like M2 didn't grow very much, and so there's something strange. There's something going on in the banks, or maybe it's the fact that the Fed has started to pay interest on reserves, and that's what clogged up the channel. Otherwise, my predictions of inflation would have been right. It's kind of the way the argument goes. Because what you see is that M2 went up a little bit more than GDP, but not a whole lot. And all of that money that was being printed just sat there in the banks, or to a limited extent showed up in people holding more cash, although not a whole lot. It's a little different. Japan went through something like this, and in Japan it was there was big increase in cash holdings. Actually, one of my economists I know well in Japan, Taka Ito, said that the only consumer durable that sells well in Japan is safes. But that, in fact, if you'd read actual James Tobin, not imaginary, but actual James Tobin, you knew that would happen. One of his big contributions was thinking through how the monetary system worked, how the banking system worked, and what he says, deposits, this mechanical, where every dollar of monetary base you creates X dollars of further expansion, is actually wrong. Deposits are determined by incentives. People decide whether they want to hold deposits. Banks decide whether they want to offer them. And that when you're near a zero interest rate, expanding, printing money is not going to change those incentives, so nothing much would happen. Now, all of this was very much in a style where it was thinking things through, making sure that everything held together, having plausible discussions of motives and what people would do in their behavior, but not making everything a rigorously derived optimization problem on the part of individuals, which is the style of modern macroeconomics. And in fact, it's virtually impossible to do Tobin-style monetary economics within the rules of the game for modern stuff. So it pretty much disappeared from the field, except it worked. That gave you the right guidance. And so we've had the situation where if you knew your antediluvian, pre-stagflation, 1970s type economics, you actually did really well. Not in the crisis itself, come to that again in a second, but actually that was, but in the aftermath. And one more thing, fiscal policy. So amazing stuff. I mean, not just practical people saying, oh, confidence is what matters, but some really harsh stuff. I mean, Robert Lucas accusing Christina Romer, who was a fine macroeconomist and the first head of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama, accusing her of doing schlock economics and of saying things she knows aren't true because her political masters want an excuse to expand the government and all that. But Christie actually said, she knows her old-fashioned macro and said, no, I think there's a multiplier of around 1.5 on government changes in government spending when interest rates are stuck, which they were because we were already at zero. How do you test that? Well, you want, ideally, a natural experiment where you just change stuff which is not in response to something else. Now, you didn't get that exactly, but what happened in Europe is a bit of that. You had a dramatic turn towards austerity imposed by fears of debt, but they were very selective. So some countries were forced into drastic increases in taxes and reductions in spending, others much less so. And that period, by the way, it's not forever. From about late 2009, early 2010, when austerity came because of the Greek crisis, up through about 2013 is when you had that period. Since then, changes in budgets have been much less systematic. They're almost kind of like random noise. And again, this is what it looks like over that period. And it's almost too good, right? The multiplier, Christie said 1.5. It turns out to be 1.508. Well, okay, that's an accident. I think that it's that close, but it does again. So old-fashioned macro. I mean, I don't know. I'm no longer teaching teaching macroeconomics in a major graduate department. I'm in a very interesting place now, but it's not the same thing. So I can't. But we really, really need to get our students back to learning this stuff, because if they come into this with this understanding, they would have given actually very good advice about what to do in the crisis. But quite a few of them didn't know this, just didn't know the old stuff, and that's because many of their professors didn't either. So, okay, I spent too long on the first one. Let me talk about the second. Financial markets. If you ask, there's a stock answer. If most people doing macroeconomics will admit that, we weren't expecting this crisis, so what should we be doing differently? And the stock answer is, we need to embed the financial sector in our models. We need to put banking in there, with the implication being that this was a gaping hole in economics. But I don't think that's true. I think that's actually very much not true. It's true that standard macro models don't have banking with the possibility of banking crisis built in as a feature, although Tobin-style macroeconomics let you at least think about how banks behave. But we did have a reasonable story about bank runs. And the question then is, why didn't we see this coming? And the answer was, at least in my case, and quite a few people I know, we knew how bank runs can happen. We understood what happened in 1930, 31. We knew about Kreditanstalt and all of those things. But no problem, because now we have deposit insurance, and so banks can't fail. And then things started to fall apart, and we learned about shadow banking. Learned that there are all of these banks that aren't called banks, that there are all of these things that basically do what a bank does, which is to borrow short and lend long, to create liquidity with very high leverage, which were subject to all of the risks of banks, but because of they didn't look like banks. They weren't big marble buildings with rows of tellers. They weren't regulated the way banks were. They weren't guaranteed the way banks were. And so when that became clear, basically people like me were wandering around saying, "Oh my God, Diamond Dybvig," because that's this classic model by Diamond and Dybvig. We said we didn't realize we should have been paying attention. We had our mouths, but we hadn't looked and realized that the institutional evolution had basically outflanked the defenses that were built in the 1930s. But once you said that, then the crisis itself was fully comprehensible. It took maybe 2 minutes once you realized how big shadow banking was to understand what was going on. Furthermore, I don't buy that banks have really been at the core of the medium-term story. We have a bunch of different indices of stress. This is the St. Louis Fed one. They all rely on things like spreads, the TED spread, where banks lend to each other, look at the difference between that interest rate and the interest rate at which they lend to governments. They all tell more or less the same story, and they do show, wow. That is not the one I want to show. So I lost it. Okay. So we'll get to that one. I don't have it. All of sorry, a little scrap here, but all of the measures of economic stress show a very severe period of economic stress, but a relatively short one. Basically, the measures start to rise in the summer of 2007. They go wild in the second half of September 2008 after Lehman fails. They spike, things are terrible. I tried unsuccessfully to get people to label this the "oh God, we're all going to die" period. But by about April of 2009, with bailouts, stress tests declaring that the banks are not in as bad shape as you think, they all start to improve dramatically. There's not a lot of sign of enduring financial stress past 2009, and yet here we are, still 7 years after the financial markets calmed, and we're still kind of depressed. So I don't think that the banks are central to it. Beyond that, now I get to the point, you see a lot of things that look like something going awry even during the periods of crisis that don't look like they're specifically involved the issues of banking and bank runs. So this is what I meant to show you. This is a funny spread. You can see it's a spread that peaks at 0, which doesn't sound all that impressive, but give me a second here. This is the difference between the interest rates on 10-year U.S. government debt and 10-year inflation-protected U.S. government debt. So it's kind of normally you think of it as an index of expected inflation. So that's why it's normally in the 2 to 2.5% range, or it used to be, because that's what people thought we were going to do in terms of longer-term inflation rates. But during the shaded stretch there, that is the Great Recession. During the recession, that number shoots up. It basically ends up being no premium at all. In fact, on 5-year bonds, the same thing goes well into positive, which looks like the market is predicting deflation. Were people really expecting deflation at that point? We have other measures. We can look at surveys. We can look at surveys both of forecasters and of the general public, and people were not expecting inflation. They were not expecting deflation. Maybe their inflation expectations had fallen a bit, but not. What was actually happening was that for a period there, basically everything except the most widely traded, most plain vanilla securities was selling at a huge discount. There was nobody to buy inflation-protected bonds, even though these are they're inflation-protected, which makes them less familiar assets, but they're liabilities of the U.S. government, and there basically is nothing safer than U.S. government debt. Partly because the U.S. is pretty reliable, but mainly I think because if the U.S. has fallen apart, the only safe assets are survival rations in your bomb shelter. So possibly something we should be worrying about in a few months. Anyway, so what was going on? What was happening was that every thinly traded asset just had no buyers. Now, I don't think that's a bank-specific issue. We do, again, have a kind of off-the-shelf model. I found myself rereading a fine paper by Andrei Sleifer and Robert Vishny from 1997 called The Limits of Arbitrage. They were thinking about what happened to third world debtors who suddenly found their debt in deep trouble. And they were also thinking a bit about the crises, the contagions that happened, and to some extent other assets. Where they said, look, we say investors will step in to buy something that's drastically undervalued. And the question is, well, which investors? Who knows? Who's ready, sufficiently prepared to step in and buy even U.S. government 10-year tips? The answer is it's a fairly limited set of players, specialist players who are, in fact, typically quite leveraged. And guess what their assets are? They're these very things that they're supposed to step in and buy. So when the price drops, they become stressed themselves. When the price drops a lot, if it drops a little, they see a buying opportunity. If it drops a lot, they become stressed themselves. And the result is that the whole, the arbitrage fails, the market goes haywire. Now you say, okay, well that's kind of an interesting story. What difference does it make? Except that I think it means that we should think of it as an exemplar of a phenomenon that has happened more than just that one case. And in particular, there's the moment when Paul de Grauw saved the euro. A little help from Mario Draghi, but so people here probably remember better. There was this period in 2011 and 2012 when all hell was breaking loose, when the interest rates, prices of Italian and Spanish bonds in particular were plunging, and interest rate spreads were rising. It looked like the whole system was going to blow apart. And the general view, which I have to say, so I was wrong. I thought that this was the markets concluding that that these countries were fundamentally insolvent. But Paul de Grauw made, now I guess at LSE, but anyway, but he made this amazing argument. He compared Spanish and British public finance and said, there's no real case here that says that Britain is more solvent than Spain, but yet Britain is able to borrow very cheaply. So what's the difference? So, well, Spain is subject to a liquidity crunch where it can actually run out of money, whereas Britain can't. Britain can have problems, but it can't run out of money because it prints the money, because it's got the pound, and its debt is in pounds. Spain was on the euro, and that he was arguing that you could have essentially self-fulfilling panics. Now, that could happen a couple of ways. One way it could happen is that people think that a cash crunch will force the country into default, and then once it's defaulted, it's going to say, well, why should we pay the whole thing? But the other is that if you think that it's a relatively limited set of investors who buy this stuff, in this case, often banks from the national banks within the same country, you can get into the same kind of failure of arbitrage that we've been talking about. And of course, if that's true, then it wouldn't take much to stop that kind of panic. You just have to have somebody step in. You have to have the central bank step in to buy stuff, be bond purchaser of last resort, or maybe just say that it will and bring the panic to an end. And Mario Draghi said 3 words. Now, that's understated. I'm actually a huge admirer of Draghi's. And it took more than the 3 words. It also took brilliant political maneuvering to be able to get to his board behind him. And it's interesting that one thing that has not happened is that they haven't actually ever done it. So if the ECB was actually called upon, in fact, to do OMT, to step in and buy bonds, we might have a very rude awakening when it turns out that they can't. But in any case, I think this is fundamentally the same story. It's the same thing that happened. It wasn't really about the financial sector, although part of it, if the players involved were to a large extent Italian banks, Spanish banks, then there was a doom loop involving those institutions, but it wasn't really about the financial sector. It's this kind of market failure, the fact that exactly when you need people to step in and buy clearly underpriced assets is exactly when they can't. And it's not something that we were unaware of, but it's a much bigger deal. Okay, I've been talking too long, so let me get to the third part a bit and talk about what we learn, about why we don't learn. And it's kind of related. So we had a story about the 70s. The story about the 1970s was that we came in with rival views, Tobin view, Friedman view, and events proved that one view was right and the other view was wrong, and that's why we changed. I've always actually, in my textbook still, I think probably will continue to be, it's presented as a good story. This is economics as science. You have a view, it's refuted by evidence, there's a different view that fits it, and so we move forward. Was the evidence always really that good? Tobin's question about the 30s, why didn't wages fall, is a pretty good one. Was a good one then, it's still a good one. And then the failure to adapt, to change views in the face of what's happened since 2008 really doesn't augur, really makes you wonder, well, was that really, if we're so flexible-minded and willing to listen to evidence, why aren't we doing it? So this is, I'm going to be a little mean here. So there's Martin Feldstein, who's a very smart economist. Alan Meltzer, who's influential, has headed the Fed, the shadow open market committee that has criticized the Fed for decades. And 2009 was their moment. The Fed was printing money like crazy, and they said, okay, inflation. So up there, you can see the dates on them if you squint a bit. In spring of 2009, there's Martin Feldstein saying inflation is looming, and Alan Meltzer saying inflation nation. And as it happens, the bottom ones are 5 years later. And it's not maybe quite so obvious from the headline, but there's Feldstein saying, the Fed is not ready because inflation is coming. And there's Alan Meltzer saying how the Fed, well, you get the picture, right? People who were saying in 2009, inflation is coming, were wrong for 5 years. In 2014, they're saying inflation is coming, and in fact, they're still saying it. You see very, very little, and you see that across the board. You just look at the various, you see it among the academic economists, people who denounced anything that sounded remotely Keynesian in 2009 are still denouncing anything remotely Keynesian, and with no acknowledgement that, there were some predictions they made that didn't come true, and some predictions that, my gang made that did come true. And of course, among the politicians, how much admission? If there's been now, there are some places have, the IMF has been surprisingly open-minded. Although I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that Olivier Blanchard, who's like everybody went to grad school with me, always kept the old-fashioned stuff in his head, but by and large, there's been almost no willingness to rethink, which suggests to me that the story of what happened on stagflation isn't really true. That what actually happened was, yes, there was a disturbing episode where prices kept rising even though unemployment was high, but that the reason that was taken as the cue for change in everything we did regarding economics was that it fitted a pre-existing desire. I think in that case, largely, in the 1970s, we already had a substantial rightward shift in the general political, cultural scene, academic as well as in real-world politics, and the coming of stagflation fitted that agenda perfectly. So they went in and said, look, this proves that all this Keynesian interventionist stuff is wrong. Now we need to change everything, and so it went right along. Whereas the post-2008 environment, even though I would say, again, in terms of actual events, was much more compelling. in terms of saying you need to do some rethinking here, did not fit the political agenda of the time and was ignored, and unfortunately within the academic world as well as the world of politics. And so we've made a lot less progress. Okay, so that ends up being a pretty downbeat assessment, but of course, it's always true. No, economics, if economics it can be disappointing, this is true of hard science as well. Max Planck, the great physicist, once said that physics progresses one funeral at a time. That essentially nobody ever admits that they were wrong, but they're gradually replaced by people with new ideas. And there's a little bit of, you can see that. I mean, there's actually some wonderful work going on among younger economists. But the main, it's certainly not hopeless, but the main thing is, you want me to give you a solution. How do we solve this thing? And the answer is, I don't know how really you make everything work better, but you have to try yourself. And so my big lesson, my uber lesson from the crisis is to always be questioning yourself and always be asking, when I believe something, when I say I believe it, do I believe it because the evidence and the logic is really compelling, or is it because it's what I want to believe, whether it fits my agenda, whether it be political, intellectual, whatever. And none of us are saints, for sure, everybody. For sure you'll find me doing things where I've bought into doctrines I shouldn't have because they're what I wanted to hear. But you have to try. You have to always be looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, do I really, am I, I'm not an idealized, sin-free scientist, but am I trying to be one? And you want to be one of those people who is always questioning themselves. This has been one hell of a lesson for world economics. If you think that everything that's happened has confirmed what you already believed, then there's something wrong with you. That can't be possible, right? But it's been a lesson. You need to have a little bit of, let's say, humility. That wasn't in the written talk, and I think I don't mean it. You can't do this stuff without a certain level of arrogance, but you have to be willing to at least to challenge yourself. You want to be always challenging yourself to ask whether this is really solid. And this has been, it doesn't remotely make up for the horrors that have been inflicted on the world, but this has been, if nothing else, the terrible events do teach you a lot about the world. They're in a way kind of experiments that God has done at our expense, and we should try to make use of them, and that means always challenging yourself to do better. Thanks. All right.
Let me introduce Professor Richard Baldwin, who played a great role in having Professor Krugman here tonight, because he was his PhD student at MIT. May I ask if Richard was a good student? Was he a good teacher?
Thing that you don't know, you don't remember at all what your students were like in class, and barely remember what you do remember. Or let's put it this way: if they have a successful and impressive career afterwards, you remember them as having been wonderful. So Richard was the best.
Very good. So we have some time now for questions and answers. So please get your questions ready. I don't know if we have microphones for the audience, or how does this? We'll just, it's an intimate room, so just stand up, say who you are, and ask your questions. You have a microphone, excellent. So I think that we can gather together a few questions at a time so that we don't get too much into a back and forth. So who's the brave soul to ask the first question? Please, back here. There's right over there, please. microphone over here?
There is one over there.
Where?
Yeah, it sort of got misplaced. Should I pass it along?
Yeah, go ahead. No, you ask your question.
Okay, fine. Professor, thank you very much for your talk. One thing that I wanted to just question you on is the institutional aspect of modern day banking. Effectively, banks spend most of their time lending to banks. The vast majority of the credit is interbank. And it isn't so much, in my view, the shadow banks outside the banks that were the problem. It was the interconnectedness of the banks themselves that triggered the big difficulty in 2008. Is that more or less your reading as well?
Let's collect a couple questions together. Who had their hand up over here before? There we go.
So, Krugman, and thank you very much for your speech. I've been dreamed to meet you for decades, and almost decades. And the question that I want to ask you is that regarding one of your articles that you have written a few years back, I do remember the title was The Triumph of the Calculated Stupidity. And you finished your article by saying that any smart grad student with proper mathematical training can always come up with his own mathematical modeling. And he can practically justify everything. And I do remember in another comments you have dedicated to the book of Thomas Piketty, and you were saying that 1% of you just agreed with his opinion that 1% of rich people are getting too much resources. And I guess my question is, in other social sciences, the ethics have become a major issue. I mean, you're also very fond of history. Let's talk about history. In history,
let's just finish the question.
Okay. My question is, your appearance here has proved once again that the history is very treacherous. Many years ago, neoliberal has...
No, can we just get a question?
Yeah.
We're getting a speech here, so can we just get a question?
Mr. Krugman, I'm thinking about, what about ethics? All scientists have ethics. In all social science, we should all have ethics. What kind of ethic a grad student should have?
Okay. I've got one last question here, and then we'll let Paul get back.
Hello, Teresa Carpenter from the Graduate Institute. I'm very pleased to be one of the many academic grandchildren in the room. My question's really quick. Can you just tell us how you answered the letter from the Queen? That'd be an interesting... Thank you.
Okay. Let me do that one first, and then I can think. So I didn't, of course, respond because I wasn't in the... I'm not one of her subjects. But no. But you see, I didn't find the failure to anticipate. This may be self-serving. I didn't see the full-on financial crisis coming. So clearly, no reasonable person could have foreseen it, right? But no, because I didn't. So, but no, it. But almost by definition, something like this is, if it was clear, it was obvious that it was going to happen, that it wouldn't have happened because people would have behaved differently. My answer to it is that we actually did have an adequate intellectual framework for understanding banking crises. What had happened was that not enough people were paying close attention to the evolution of institutions, and that didn't realize that. I have to admit, I don't think did I even know what repo was before the crisis. I don't think I did. So I just assumed that a bank was a bank was a bank, and that was a failure, but it wasn't a deep conceptual failure. It was a kind of understanding of the real world was kind of important, but it wasn't at the level of the fundamental concepts being wrong. By the way, I'm not sure. No, I don't think that in the end, although yes, there's tremendous intra-banking system leverage, but I think it was the stuff that not necessarily outside the bank holding companies. Something like Citigroup is a bunch of stuff, but it was the stuff that was outside the depository institutions. This was very much a crisis that was not about depository institutions. So I think that's the right way to think about it. And there's a question. We do have this sort of multiple layers of financial system where the volume of credit is huge because it's kind of like, actually, it's kind of like value-added chains in global trade right now. You have stuff that goes at multiple, which is one of Richard's great obsessions. Rightly so. But I'm not sure that layering is so much the issue. I mean, in fact, we can say something about that specifically, which was that what's really striking is how similar the financial crises in the U.S. and in Europe looked. Even though, now that there's a second wave that comes from the problems of the euro area, but there was a first wave of European crises, but they're institutionally, they were very different. The United States was these shadow banks, exotic financial instruments, CDOs, and all of that. The European one was mostly pretty much straightforward interbank lending. And so if you like, you could call it that, but it was the debt that the banking system owed to itself. But it was, the real problem was simply that there was a lot of leverage that wasn't covered by any kind of guarantee system. So if a German Landesbank lends to a Spanish Caja to finance a housing bubble, yeah, that creates a lot of vulnerability, because even if the deposits are insured, the wholesale market borrowing is not, and that was the point. Oh, asset. Look. I think that was what the students have to know, and the answer is, well, lots of stuff. The balance is always hard to strike. One of the iron laws of research and economics, I was told this 40 years ago, was that the optimal amount of math, the right amount of math that people should have, is the amount that you have. Because anyone who has less math than you just doesn't have the tools, and anyone who has more math is just focused on silly stuff, and everyone thinks that. So that's a hard one to draw. But look, I had a great teacher myself in Rudy Dornbusch, the late Rudy Dornbusch, who studied here, right?
He studied here, right?
Yes.
As an undergraduate.
As an undergraduate. But anyway, but when I was starting to write a thesis, he had what I think is still wonderful advice for any student, which is, he said, just for now you need to figure out what you're going to write about. Do not read any more economics papers. Do not spend any more time with models. Go and read history. Go and read business magazines, read The Economist, read Business Week, read the Financial Times, look at the world. And then come back to it with all this tech that you've accumulated. And I think that's still the right way to do it. Because we can. The smart graduate student, I was actually mostly thinking about strategic trade at the time, but a smart graduate student can always come up with a model that will justify anything. The question of what it is you should be doing, you need to be looking out there at the world.
Very good. Very good. We have a question here. Let me see somebody over there. This student here in blue shirt. Yeah, the blue shirt, please. Yeah, you go there. And then. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for your remarks. I was just wondering, how do you think past financial crises, such as the one that happened in 1997 in Asia, has informed how international organizations maybe react to or perceive present economic conditions?
Oh, that's... Oh,
yeah, let me just take the in blue there, blue shirt, who I saw first.
Yes, good evening. And in 2 weeks from now in this room, there's going to be the viewing of the film The Great European Disaster with Bill Emmett. My question for you is, what is your vision of the future of the European common currency, of the euro?
Good question. Let's just go with those two then, please.
Shall I just...
10 more minutes?
Okay. All right. So, yeah, well, I think the Asian financial crisis and all of the things related, I think, had a very big influence, a benign one, in the sense that, I mean, a lot of people were really struck hard by that was kind of a dress rehearsal it turned out, for the Asian crisis of 97, 98, and also the ongoing problems in Japan were kind of dress rehearsal for the crisis that we all entered in 2008. And a fair number of people took that as at least as a warning. I mean, I wrote a whole book, and, Return of Depression Economics was basically saying what has happened to Asia could happen to us, which unfortunately it did. So that meant that a lot of people, or a significant group of people, some of whom found themselves in a position to influence policy, were at least somewhat forewarned. So when I started at Princeton, actually, I think I was brought there in part to join what was a small group of people who were obsessed by the Japanese experience and saying, the fact, if Japan can get caught in this kind of trap, maybe it can happen to the rest of us. Myself, Lars Svensson, came back to work here. Mike Woodford, who eventually moved to Columbia, and fourth guy, what was his name? Ben Bernanke. Don't know what happened to him. Right? So we were all, at least some extent, aware of this. And the liquidity, the crises that took place, in the high-speed crises that took place in the smaller Asian countries, were very much on people's minds, and they did mean that. Not so. I mean, I think the IMF is a secondary role here, and it was more there was a lot of technical stuff involving swap lines, involving basically keeping the money flowing that central banks did, including internationally, that had played a bigger role than is generally understood in containing the crisis, which does kind of segue into the European thing, because it's funny, in the euro area, those lessons were not applied at first. So that you had a situation where you had countries, I mean, people should have said, I have to say I wasn't as clear about this as I should have been, should have said that, any euro area country is quite a lot like the problem we had examined, we come to realize quite well that countries like Indonesia were subject to very severe crises almost out of nowhere because their debt was in someone else's currency. And of course, in the euro area, everybody's debt is in someone else's currency, or in nobody's currency. And that the possibility, we should have, whatever it takes should have happened long before it did, should have realized the need for a lender of last resort. And we also, I mean, the lessons of the Asian crisis also seem to be that there was a fair bit of evidence that austerity had high costs, even from the late 90s in Asia, which were not absorbed in the European rescue programs. Now, looking forward, I mean, I think that the ECB as lender of last resort has been taken on board. Maybe we'll find out if push comes to shove. The trouble, I think it turns out that a single currency, though, has bigger problems even than the old optimum currency area stuff said. We had this debate back in the early 90s. Is Europe really ready for a single currency? And basically the ugly Americans, or to some extent the ugly Anglo-Saxons, said, compare it with the dollar area, otherwise known as the United States, which has fiscal integration, it has banking integration, it has high labor mobility, although it's not clear that's actually a helpful thing. Europe doesn't have anything like the same things. Maybe you're really not ready for this, and that was considered a very unacceptable position. But on top of that, what I'm now kind of obsessed with on the European front is the aggregate problem. Secular stagnation is back. The notion that persistent economic weakness may be a concern. I'm furious with Larry Summers because I tried to say something about it, but I was incomprehensible and disorganized, and then he gave a brilliant speech on paper. And so not only am I pissed that he's getting the credit, but I'm pissed that he deserves it. But anyway, European demography looks like Japan with a 15-year lag. Declining working age population. Europe looks like a poster child for secular stagnation. The worst thing you can have if you are really at risk of kind of an ongoing low-grade depression, as far as the eye can see, would be to have a system that has an inherent deflationary bias. And that's what you have. You have a system in which debtor countries are forced into severe austerity, but surplus countries have no incentive to to be expansionary. You have a world in which monetary policy tends to be effectively more contractionary than the headline numbers would suggest, because there are always going to be countries in trouble that can't borrow easily. And so the system works really badly. The interesting thing is the political cohesion is far greater than I had imagined. I mean, if you had told, I think, almost anybody what the Greek story would look like in terms of GDP, unemployment, you would have said, oh, they will leave. Nobody can stand that. There will be a radicalization. There will maybe either they will leave the euro, or Golden Dawn will seize power, or they will leave the euro and Golden Dawn will seize power. And so far, not. It's terrible. The human cost has been enormous, but they stay with it. People are not willing to break with the idea of Europe, and because in the European vocabulary, the euro membership in the euro is taken to be that. The feeling is that if you leave the euro, you have left Europe. Everybody stays, and of course, then the really weird thing is, given all of those horrors, Brexit never happened, and given really almost trivial stuff, Brexit did. But anyway, which just goes to show that the world is still a very complicated, confusing place. But no, what I worry about in Europe is I don't see a huge crisis anytime soon, unless it comes from the political side. But it does look like it's a kind of a poorly performing, underperforming, low-grade system that will continue to just create lots of problems.
Thanks. And I'll take one more question, and then we'll end. So right here on the stairs, please. And on a cheery note.
Thank you very much, Professor Krugman. You talked about this secular stagnation. I would like to ask you a question. I mean, we know less this in Europe, but there is this productivity bias, actually. Lately, US productivity, working, right, has been down. I mean, the growth is low, but actually, I saw for the last 3 quarters, it has been down slightly, about 0.5%. Now, some people explain this because it takes time, right, that new technologies reach the most of the companies and the population. Others might say that there is a statistical bias because it's not accounted. What do you think of this? And do you think it's a real danger, or is it for you?
Well, I think the productivity slowdown is real. I mean, it's probably true that the statistics understate productivity gains, but they always have. No reason to believe that's more true now. There's a pretty good case to be made that, look, we just had the iPhone 7, and it's very, very hard to figure out, is there really any fundamental change from the iPhone 6? I have another, if people see, there's a cartoon strip, Dilbert, which is a satire of office life. Actually, the guy who writes it turns out to be a horrible person and is backing Trump, but never mind that. But you can look at the comic strip has been around since I think 1989. And you can look at Dilberts from the early 1990s, which portray office situations. Do those look old-fashioned? Do they look we are basically our society have many more office workers than manufacturing workers. Does the office 1993 look drastically different from the office of 2016? The answer is no, it actually doesn't, which tells me I think that the relative stagnation is real. We have really nifty stuff, we're all running around with NASA-level powered computers in our shirt pockets, but in terms of real difference, I think not. Now, is that a temporary phenomenon? Is there something better coming over the horizon or not? And, I'm friends with both Bob Gordon, who says, no, the great ideas are all behind us, and Hal Varian, who, as working for Google, is obliged to say that great stuff is really happening. So I can believe either one, depending sort of on what I had for breakfast. But but there's no guarantee. You'd have to say, and if you take the longer perspective, if you compare the world of 2016 that we actually have with what people 50 years ago thought we would have, we've underperformed, clearly. Where technology is, watch 2001: A Space Odyssey. That was supposed to be 15 years ago. And we ain't there, nothing like there. So there's a possibility that we really have, at least are in a long technological lull. And, but that shouldn't mean that we have to have mass unemployment.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give Paul a big round of applause. Thank you all for coming tonight, and there'll be more in this semester coming.